So hello, everyone. Welcome to our Voices and Perspective series. Today, we are honoring the Asian American experience. My name is Acacia Warren, and I am the single subject coordinator for the Master of Arts in Teaching and Credential program here at UC Irvine.
Thank you, Acacia, and I am co-moderating. Honored to be with this wonderful panel today, and I want to welcome everyone. My name is Virginia Panish, and I am the director of the Master of Arts in Teaching program.
So just a little bit of background. This webinar series highlights, honors, and contextualizes the lived experiences of each panelist. We aim to heighten awareness and agency around critical topics such as racial justice, equity, immigration, culture, education, and whatever else comes up. And we want to listen, learn, and grow from the experiences of others. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge who's in the audience. The greater majority of those in the audience are educators, either K-12 at the elementary, middle school, high school level, or at the university level. So our faculty and staff who work with undergraduates and graduate students. And then we have those who aren't educators, so welcome as well. And then we also want to welcome the family and friends of our
All right, so I'd like to thank, I'd like to thank Acacia Warren and Susan Thoma so much for all of the work they've put into initiating these panels of speakers. It really has enriched our program, and it's been an important way for us to connect with voices we don't always hear, especially in this year when we're feeling disconnected from each other. So I think it's really brought a really enriched the experience of a lot of people this year. And so I'd also like to thank Elizabeth Pena. She is the Dean of Faculty Development and Diversity, and she's been very supportive of this initiative. And of course, Dean Aram of the School of Education has also been extremely supportive of this speaker series. So thanks to both of them.
So the audience is encouraged to use the chat feature for affirmations and connections, so shared throughout the webinar. So if a panelist says something that resonates with you, or that you make a personal connection, go ahead and share that in the chat. It's our way of affirming. We can't finger snap, so we can affirm through digitally through the chat. And if there's time at the end, we will have a Q&A. However, if there isn't time for a Q&A, we're still thankful to listen and learn from our panelists today. Okay, we are recording this, and it will be uploaded onto YouTube, and the link will be on the UCI MAT website. Okay, so now on to our panelists. Welcome to our panelists. Thank you for participating in this special event. I'm going to ask each panelist to introduce themselves by saying their name, how they identify racially, say a little bit about what they do professionally, and then we're going to allow our panelists to dedicate this webinar to someone special in their lives. And so we will start with June.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me. Super honored and glad to be in community with you all today. So I'm an associate professor here at the UC Irvine School of Education. My research actually focuses on the mixture of technology design and community partnerships. So I like to design new solutions with community members. I identify as Korean American, and I'd like to dedicate this webinar. I'll speak a little bit about my immigrant experience. And so I'm going to dedicate this to the generation before me, my parents and uncles and folks who came to America. And I'll pass it on.
Hi, my name is Young-Soo Grace Kim. I am a professor and senior associate dean here at the School of Education. How do I identify myself? That's a good question. I'm a first generation female immigrant. Do I see as a Korean living in America or Korean American? I think I actually had a discussion about this with my husband. I think I'm somewhere in the middle. I would love to dedicate this webinar to my parents.
Hi, everybody. I'm Hui Chung, and I'm Vietnamese Chinese American. I am the project scientist and director of research for the UCI Writing Project, and I'm also a lecturer for the Masters in Teaching and Undergraduate Ed Sciences program at UCI. I would like to dedicate this webinar to all hardworking immigrants, my parents among them.
Hi all, I'm Kelly Lee, and I identify as Vietnamese American. I'm a first generation graduate. I grew up in inner city LA, and I am the director of the UCI Science Project. And today I would like to dedicate this series to the future, actually. So to my own two kids, Weston and Russell, who are watching right now. I think it's a really big deal that, you know, they get to see someone who looks like them, you know, serving on a panel like this to really be able to elevate these stories. So thank you.
Hi, I'm Susan Tomobergi, and I identify as Japanese American. I'm considered a Nisei, so in the Japanese American community, that means I'm the generation born here and my parents were the immigrants, so second generation. I'm the coordinator of the multiple subject program here at UCI, and I also dedicate this to my parents who paved the way.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Young. I am a lecturer and a supervisor in the MAT program. And I had the same conversation with my husband. I think that must have been the topic of conversation. What generation are we actually? So probably like half generation, because I came when I was 8, which kind of makes my son 4th generation, I guess, on my husband's side. But yeah, there's always that which generation do I actually belong in? And does my immigrant experience make me a first generation because I grew up here? Or does it make me a 0 generation because I wasn't born here? So I like to dedicate this webinar to really the unheard voices of the Asian American community, because so much of our history has been lost in translation or just never been talked about.
Okay, thank you, panelists, for your introductions. I'm going to start with our first question. So what are 2 moments, experiences, or stories that you would like to share with the audience about your family's history? And we'll start with June.
Thanks. I guess the 2 things that come to mind, one is my family and also my partner's family, our parents, they are primarily working class. And so they have been laborers all their life. And I want to share that just because there's a large diversity in socioeconomic experiences in the Asian American community. And that's something that I'd love to share with folks more widely, right? And so my parents were postal workers, and my father-in-law, he's still a gardener. He just turned 80 years old this year, and he's still doing people's lawns every day around the neighborhood. And actually, I admire that a lot, because that's kind of like what I want to aspire to when I'm 80, like I'm still walking around doing stuff. The second story is I primarily have grown up in places in the US where Asian Americans are the extreme minority. So I was born in Oklahoma, and then I grew up in Rhode Island. And so I've experienced not being kind of in the majority or having kind of heterogeneity in experiences. And coming to Southern California is really the first time I've ever been in a place where there's a Pan-Asian kind of experience and a lot of variance and diversity there.
I would like to share just a little bit about my parents. My parents' generation represents a snapshot of modern Korean history. So my mom was born in Japan, actually in 1938, and her father was drafted to work in a mine, and he actually died there in an accident. So my grandmother and her 4 children came back to Korea in 1945 when the Korea gained independence. And of course, with that, they had to deal with poverty, right? So my mom had to start working to support the family, and she didn't have any formal education. And my dad was a Korean War veteran. So one of the memories, very precious memories, that is still very close to my heart to this day about my parents, especially my mom, is when I was in 3rd grade. I grew up in Korea, and it was in Korea in 3rd grade. There's a day called a picnic in the field. It's like, similar to field trips here in the US. So this is the day when we have games, special treats, etc. So it's a day filled with excitement, right? And it's very exciting for all the kids. And on that morning, before the field trip, all the kids were in the playground and excited and just doing things. And I had to wait for my mom by the school gate because the day prior, my mom was working in another town. She couldn't get back home on the same day because of no transportation. So because she knew how excited I was, she actually walked for miles at early dawn to make it. And she brought some goodies and a nice new shirt. So I was really excited about it, but just that memory that's imprinted, just kind of in a way, just an indicator or it signifies, her care and her hard work for family.
Thanks, Young. That's beautiful.
Oh.
So I have 2 stories that I drew from our history. First is that it took my parents 4 tries to leave Vietnam, and as both people. And the first 3 tries, they were thwarted, by pirates, storms, and even corrupt officials who took everything from people on the boat. Like they just left them with nothing, right? And but each time, my parents, found ways to try to escape, so that they could, have a brighter future for their family and for the other family members. So it was on the 4th try that they were able to leave Vietnam, and there were dozens of people crowded on this boat, and they were even being shot at. And my brother narrowly, he was on, I guess, on top of the boat a little bit, and the bullet went right by him. So you imagine just the harrowing kind of experiences. But I shared that with you because I think it shows how strong a lot of families are and how they just want a better life for themselves and their families. And I want to thank the countries that welcomed the boat people in. So like Malaysia, even though it was an island, my parents were able to stay on that island for a while before they were sponsored to America by a church, and then that's how we were able to be here. So I want to thank these countries that welcomed them. And then another piece of history was that I was told that my grandparents were illiterate farmers, and when the French tried to colonize Vietnam, a lot of times they had to sign loyalty papers, and if they didn't sign them, or if they signed the wrong ones, they could be executed. And so my grandfather was almost tricked into signing one of these papers, but it was only because a neighbor who was literate knew what the documents were saying and convinced my grandfather not to sign them, that we were able to still be here. So I share that story because I think it shows how important literacy is, and that's also one of the motivations why I am also involved in the literacy field. Thanks.
Thank you for sharing that. Actually, a lot of what you said, I felt like was a lot of what I was told as well when I was a lot older. So in my family, every time I asked about anything related to history, I was told it was rude. I was told that I couldn't ask these questions. But as a child, you know, you just kind of accept it. And then as you get older, you get more curious. You want to know a little bit more about who you are and your cultural background. And I think, to be honest, it talked down to it was just too painful to relive. And so, you know, my mom's a single mom and doing the best she could, always working two jobs. And I think you know, it was just one of those things where she was just trying to move forward. But, you know, from what I remember of what my aunties and uncles would share with me about my mom and her experience, you know, I find that I'm so lucky to inherit like her genius and her resilience. Um, and so, you know, my mom was a refugee from the Vietnam War as well. Actually, at the time, um, it was very different than what I had heard about Vietnamese people, because I didn't hear it from my direct family initially. But you know, when we think of Vietnamese people, we tend to think third world country, very poor, you know, what have you. But actually, my mom, when she finally opened up when I was older, would tell me stories about, you know, how wealthy her family was. She was part of the upper class and had her own home when she was 7 and had 14 maids. And, you know, she didn't get past middle school, but she learned calculus in 3rd grade. And there were so many things that like I just didn't understand about that society. But I realized that coming from that world and having the means to be able to immigrate first, that was something. So you just heard Hui share his family, you know, tried several times. My mom was had a very different experience growing up in Vietnam. And so, you know, to try to survive, she had to get fake papers and all of that because she was being drafted because she was already 18. And then she was sent by herself without her family to try to make it to America first. And they essentially took the family gold bricks, is what she told me. Like that's what it took at the time to even get on a boat. And instead of taking her all the way to America, she landed in Malaysia, but landed in a bad part of Malaysia where she later explained had she been found, she would have been shot. So for 2 years, she lived like a homeless person on the beach and trying to figure out just how to survive until, you know, she said just by luck one day, somebody was sailing by and recognized her because she had a you know, a wealthy upbringing. And so I guess this was someone who once worked for her. And, you know, she was very kind to them. And so he took her the rest of the way. And, you know, and then she had to start over here. So I can't even imagine, honestly, what her life was really before, and then coming here and having that survivalist mentality, right? Of doing whatever you can to make it. So that's one story I wanted to share. And the second one is when I realized that my mom spoke 5 languages, it was really weird for me. So my mom started when she came here as a sweatshop worker in downtown LA. And then the factory burned down in the Rodney King riots, essentially. And then just got really lucky and went to an open call at Howard Hughes and became an electrical, like technical worker there. And through that whole experience, I found out, you know, of course she speaks Vietnamese, that's her native language, but because she went to school, even though she didn't go past middle school, she had to learn French. And then when she worked in downtown LA as a sweatshop factory worker, she had to learn Spanish. And then she also had to learn Chinese because she was trying to, you know, make it work essentially. So she was traveling a lot for different types of jobs, whatever she could do possible. And then lastly, she learned English when she got the job at Howard Hughes. And I learned even then, when she got that job, she didn't know enough English to secure it. So her older sister had to go with her and at the time brought her daughter, which was just a newborn baby at the time. And anytime the interviewer asked her a question, my aunt would talk in Vietnamese to the baby so my mom would understand and be able to respond in some sort of way. And that's how she got the job. But yeah, I just I'm in awe of how amazing my mom is.
It's hard to follow all of you. I guess one story I'd like to share kind of represents how I feel like just growing up in this country. as being Asian American, not white, not black, but like just this area in the middle. My dad was a child during World War II in Okinawa. That's where a lot of the actual land battles took place. So he said that after the war, the whole economy was quite devastated there, and there was really not much opportunity. So he took a job on a commercial ship that kind of went all over the world delivering stuff. And he remembers landing in Mobile, Alabama, probably in the late 50s. And he tried to go to the bathroom. And at that time, there was the colored bathroom and the white bathroom. And him just thinking, well, where do I go? And so he said, well, I'm not white. So he went into the colored bathroom, and he said people yelled at him. Like, he was not supposed to go to the colored bathroom. He was supposed to go to the white bathroom. And he just thought, I didn't know where I was supposed to go. And that kind of, to me, it just, as an Asian American growing up here, that's kind of been the whole route, the route of my entire life. It's like, well, which way do I go? The other is that my parents, even though they're both born in Okinawa, and my mom was post-war, she was born after the war. And it's a tiny island, but they met in Los Angeles, and they got married in Los Angeles, and they raised their family there. So June, I think we might be related, because my dad was the Japanese gardener until a few years ago. So I don't know, is that your father-in-law?
Well, yeah, I agree. It's hard to follow all of your stories. And I think for me, I have a before immigration story and a after immigration story. My before immigration story was happy. I mean, I can't recall a time when I wasn't happy. As a child and having two parents and living with my grandparents, it didn't matter how big or small my living situation was. It was just a house full of mirth. And I played with my brothers, and my family owned a textile factory in Taiwan. And we would visit that factory a lot. And every time we went, the employees would, just play with us and say, the kids are here, and they would push us around the cart, and it was just a happy childhood. We had friends, we had neighbors, when we always hung out with each other, and it was literally just a apartment building with a courtyard, and we would just hang out after school and go to each other's apartments, and that's what I remember of my childhood. And then came the news that we were going to move to the US. And so many things changed in that one moment. One, we had to start taking English classes. I was terrible. My parents couldn't believe how bad I was trying to learn English. I was worse. I was the worst out of all three kids, maybe because I just really didn't want to learn it. Two, my mom decided that I needed to have a complete change. And so she chopped my hair and gave me this humongous perm. So I came with a beehive. And that was like, and literally, it kind of just made me feel like I am no longer myself. And so I came to the United States, and I just remember things went south, like quickly south. I couldn't fit in. We didn't know anyone. My dad was supposed to come with us, and that was always the plan, that he would come with us to the US after he settled the family business, but he never ended up coming. So it was just my mom and the three of us trying to make it work in this new country where we couldn't speak English. She didn't have a job. So quickly she surrounded herself with just the Chinese community. And that's how I got by for most of my childhood and adolescent years. And I didn't even know that there was a world beyond the Chinese community. We shopped at the Chinese market. We ate at Chinese restaurants. We hung out with a group of Chinese people. So going off to college was like an eye-opening experience. Like, what? There's a whole other world out there that I wasn't familiar with. But yeah, and then later on, I found out that my mom didn't have a college degree. She had a vocational degree in home economics. So in hindsight, like I remember going into my doctoral program, and I was talking to one of the professors, and she said, you know, your story interested me from the get-go. For all intents and purposes, you should have never made it. And I thought, what do you mean I should have never made it? And it wasn't in a bad way. It was like your story, it was, you had to overcome a lot. You know, nowadays we talk about ACEs. I didn't know what ACEs were back then. But now when I look back at my own childhood, we grew up with a whole lot of ACEs that we weren't even aware of. So I think she was trying to get at that, you know, as children, you don't realize the ACEs that impact you. And there have been incredible people along the way who have tried to, you know, who have given me support throughout my educational journey. And I do wonder, had it not been for so many of these people who provided support, where would I have been, or where would I be today? So I think I'm probably jumping the gun and going to like question number 7 here. Like, what would you want to tell future educators? But yeah, but just to like, and just hearing all of our experiences, I'm reminded how similar our experiences are, and yet how different our experiences are. And yeah, and I think that when we look at the students in front of us, there are no two people who are exactly alike.
Thank you, Evelyn. Yeah, I mean, that's actually a good segue into the education questions, so, which is coming up next. Thanks to all the panelists. And the next question is, how were you raised to view and understand education? And we'll stick with the same pattern. June, you can start us out.
Sure. I'll try to be concise to give space to others to chat as well. But I guess the salient thing for me, education was really a hope for social mobility in my family. And so that was kind of a big salient thing. And as a child born here in the US, and with all of our parents going through much to get here, going to school, going through school to kind of make it in life was a kind of a big deal. But also there's a very strong familial responsibility. And so for me, my experience was having that awareness of like, well, I'll be taking care of everybody also, right? Like, so everybody, the rest of the family through there. So that was definitely a part of my world growing up. And then a unique experience, maybe not unique, but because growing up in Rhode Island and Oklahoma, my parents made a decision to not speak our language to us as children, because I think they were very much in like survival mode. And they were at that time, that generation, very afraid of us not being accepted or whatnot if we weren't native English speakers. And so they really pushed English on us. And so I don't speak Korean. I understand and speak maybe at a preschool level. But that actually was a really interesting choice, because it was always kind of a tension growing up, right? And having lost a little bit of that growing up. But now looking back, I think, wow, it's such a moment in time that my parents grew up in and had to make a decision like that. So that was really salient in my educational experience.
So I think mine is similar to June's. Education was basically the only means for social mobility for our family. And one of my dad's biggest regrets he had in his life was he was offered to study in high school and college in a city, but he actually said no because he had to support his family as the eldest son. That's very traditional value, and at that time it was really important. So, hearing that and seeing, my family's hard work, education, I never doubted that I would not pursue high kind of a college degree because that was the only thing that we could think about to support ourselves. So I never doubted that.
I think this might be a common thread. Yes, education was seen as a way out of poverty because, as immigrants, when we came here, or when my parents came here, they actually, she was pregnant with me in Malaysia, but she didn't know about it until she came here. And then, so then I was born like 4 months later after they settled in America. But, growing up, they just kept saying like, education is what you need to better yourself and better, better your future. And so the three of us, I have two older siblings. We all saw education as important and as a way to support our families when we grow up and to support our parents. It's always about honoring your ancestors and your parents. And so what is good for you will be good for them. So that's sort of how I was taught.
So my experience was definitely very different. I shared that I grew up in inner city LA and I went to a Title I school. I think because my mom didn't go past middle school, and for the similar reasons that others have shared, she comes from a family of 9 siblings, and she's one of the eldest ones, and so she had to care for her siblings. But I think because she came here and then started working for Howard Hughes and then L3 and Boeing and just kept rising up because she's amazing. Education actually wasn't as valued, I feel like, as it should have been. And I say that because when I got into college, she didn't want me to go. And actually, it was like almost like the ultimate betrayal that I decided um, to go against her wishes. And that was because I have a younger brother. And just like how it was her responsibility to raise her siblings, I think she felt it was my responsibility to put off my ambition to raise my younger brother, who is 10 years younger than me. And so it was very different. But I know it was just I feel like a difference in our perspectives. But to be honest, the reason for why I ended up leaving my home at a younger age, because I decided to pursue college against her wishes, was because I saw how hard my mom worked. She worked 2 jobs. Like sometimes she was coming home at 3 a.m. in the morning. And, I just felt like if I had the opportunity to have a family in the future, I would want time with them. And so, I taught in inner cities for a long time. And, the students that I taught before, the question often came up of like, why should we even pursue college? I have a cousin, I have a friend who went to college and they got their degree and they still didn't get the job of their dreams. And the one thing I shared was that I felt that going to college and at least graduating would give you a leg up. Even if I ended up going to college and I ended up working at a Target, I felt like I would be one of the first promoted in that space just because I had a degree. And so another thing I shared that I felt was tied to just kind of my upbringing is, I didn't want my mom's sacrifices to be in vain. And I don't feel like she put that pressure on me, but just knowing her story and her journey here and everything that she's given up, I just felt like I needed to make her proud. And one way to do that was to make sure that I had time for my own family, that I could pursue a career. And, it's my mom works for whatever hours my mom works in a month. As a teacher, I was making the equivalent in salary in a week. And there's a clear difference here. And so, yeah, for me, education was very different. It was definitely not pushed upon. It was more like I got a good job and I didn't even go past middle school, So you shouldn't have to go to college, to land a good job as well. So I think that there were just misconceptions, that had a role in it.
I think my parents also saw it as the only option to get an education. Like your mom, my dad has an 8th grade education, and my mom finished high school. And just seeing them work these really challenging jobs. My dad, like father-in-law, he was a gardener up until recently, and my mom cleaned houses. And so they really wanted to make sure that I didn't do that. Yet, because they weren't raised in this country, they didn't know how to navigate education as much either. So it's always been a challenge. But I think growing up in the 70s, I might be the oldest one here. Growing up in the 70s, there were no, or very few Asian role models. I think today we've got, Naomi Osaka, Jeremy Lin, and we've got, Joe Coy and Ali Wong. I mean, there's like other routes for Asian Americans to take. But back then, there were very few role models for me to see. So education was seen as the route to the American dream.
Yeah, I think in my family, education was it was deemed as important, but it wasn't pushed. My dad didn't come, but he didn't come because he made a sacrifice not to come. It wasn't like he didn't want to come. He also knew that he needed to support his family, and had he decided to come to the US, he would have never found a job. He would have been making a minimum wage, and he would have been working probably night shifts, and he would have thrown away his own college degree to barely make it in the US. So he stayed in Taiwan and wasn't able to spend any time with his family, just so that we could have it living here. But my mom being here without knowing any English and without really any support, she didn't have the wherewithal to support any of our educational endeavors. I think she was just way too overwhelmed to even try to figure out how to support us. So we kind of, climbed that ladder on our own. And more than anything, it was our friends who pushed us. We did the same thing that our friends did pretty much. But yeah, unlike a traditional Asian family, my brother went into art. I went into education. My younger brother went into accounting. No lawyers, no doctors, no engineers. And we turned out okay.
And thank you for sharing. Our next question is, what role has immigration played in your personal and professional life?
I think, something that I've really enjoyed listening to everyone's stories about and resonates with me is that immigrant experience really does drive a lot of kind of our mindsets and sense of responsibility for family. So that has driven a lot of my life. And I think in addition, immigration, like what is that? Let me think about that for a second. I think it plays a little bit into the next question, just to foreground a little bit. So I think that immigrant experience in America for me, I'm not sure if the folks around me in my community have ever known what to make of me at growing up, right? So like I did not immigrate here, but my parents did. Right. And so like all this like murkiness about what generation I am and like, what am I really, like, where do I fit in? That confusion also spilled over to my friends growing up, right? Like they didn't really quite know. I was like, it's like this weird guy whose face looks different, but he speaks with a Boston accent, and like, and so it was that kind of weirdness growing up, people not knowing where to place you or like how to interact with you sometimes, right? So I find that carries over into my professional life a little bit. So like I've worked in Maryland, and I've worked in New York City, and I've worked here in Southern California, and like my positioning in those places are totally different. And I can go into more detail, but like in Maryland, like the Asian American population is maybe like less than 10% of the population. And so that experience of not knowing quite where to place me was like clear there. In New York City and Southern California, there's a larger Asian population. And so there's a lot more like, I think I get treated more as an individual in those places because people just have more exposure, right? Whereas in a place like Maryland or Rhode Island, you're treated more like the stereotype a little bit, right? And so that's been kind of a unique experience in my professional career.
Thank you, Jill. That's very interesting, insightful. So I grew up in Korea entirely until college, and I even taught there. So my experiences, I think, is pretty different. So I would say personally, kind of coming here and living here expanded my views in some ways. You know, so you know. Growing up in Korea, of course, I had a very strong identity about who I was as a Korean, and I saw America as an American government, what the American government did. So American, imperialism and all those pieces. But when I came here, I saw people. I saw people in America. I saw people in Korea. And now looking back, I see people in Korea, somewhat differently now than I used to before. I would say, in terms of my personal kind of impact and kind of growth in my personal life, in terms of the, after coming here, there were a couple of, I guess, pieces. One is a very personal one, as I just noted. I grew up with this, I was told growing up, you're the 32nd generation of this Kim clan and with a certain branch, right? And so family and ancestry going back to the 600s, etc. Now, when I met my husband, who's not Korean, it was a lot of conflict and it caused a lot of family distress. So I had to do some soul searching. And also, of course, both sides of the family, my husband's family, my own family, of course, had to go through some thinking, etc. But after marriage, because of that, I had to kind of learn a lot of subcultures within Asian American community because my husband is Filipino Chinese, and that comes with different subcultures, right? So that was definitely expanding my horizon and understanding. The other one, I guess, is having lived in different parts of the US. I lived in San Francisco for quite a while. And I also lived in Boston, Cambridge area. That's very different in terms of, from my personal experience, that's pretty different in terms of culture, subculture. I also lived in Tallahassee, Northern Florida, culturally pretty south. That's also pretty different. And now I'm here. So each time point, it really presented different challenges, but it really has enriched my understanding of different subcultures and diversity within the US. In terms of professional, I guess, impact, I was a teacher in Korea, and then I continued my teaching here in the US. And the teaching experience, because Korea is a homogeneous country, here, my teaching experience here in the US really kind of provided me with understanding about this race and ethnicity piece as more of a social system. I didn't have that understanding before that. And a lot of experience with language minority children and children from very different linguistic and cultural and socioeconomic backgrounds when I was teaching in the inner city. So this is really kind of I appreciate that experience so much because that is really the foundation of my work and research right now.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah. Um, so as I stated before, I am a child of immigrants. My siblings are considered generation 1.5, and I think I am second generation, even though I feel like I'm more of like a first generation person. And it's only because, right, like helping our parents navigate the system, being a language broker, translating for them on almost every document. I mean, they lived here for however long I've been old. That's how long they've been here in America, and they still, struggle with English. And right now, like navigating their medical bills and like trying to figure out like how to get them what they need. Like that's still something that I'm learning. But it's a part of our lives and as immigrants, and that's at least they have that, right? So I think that we feel like at least they have access to medical care. So that's a good thing. But also like being a child of immigrants, you also sometimes like the first in your family to do something, especially in education, right? Because like as you stated, my dad's a gardener, my mom's manicurist, and they had ambitions in Vietnam, but when the war started, all those ambitions were taken away. And so when they came here, and then they wanted my siblings and I to have a better education, um, like, my sister and I, even though she's older than me, we both graduated from our undergraduate institutions at the same time, right? So it took some navigation, like, sort of like my brother was the pilot, and then my sister was the actual person to go through, and then myself was like, I benefited from what they learned or the challenges that they had. And then so I'm the first in my family to have a master's and to have a PhD, but I still have problems navigating academia sometimes as I don't know what I don't know, right? And sometimes that's hard because um meaningful folks think that they can empathize with your experiences, but then it's hard because no two experiences are the same. And so I think personally that's been kind of hard, like sometimes to be the first in your family to try something and to have that pressure of not failing, because you feel like if you fail, then you're letting down the rest of your family, right? Or you're laying down future generations. So there's that pressure, but I'm getting over it. But also, I think there's just also this perspective of just in my professional life, it's helping me overcome obstacles because I feel like if my family can overcome what they have in the past, I can do that too here with the privileges that I have, because I feel like being the first, in my family to be born in America, I have privileges that my siblings don't have. Like, right, like I didn't have to take a citizenship test to be a citizen here, and I think I benefited from my childhood being in America, whereas my siblings grew up in Vietnam as children, and they lack of medical care or access to medical care, so they have different problems that didn't have to face. So basically, I'm just saying that I feel privileged to be the American child, right? And professionally, I empathize with a lot of my students who are immigrant students and who are English learners. And that's why professionally, I work with an intervention that tries to help teachers of English learners to learn how to write better. So that's how I feel immigration has impacted my life personally and professionally. Thanks.
So I was just trying to think through like what stories I could tell to kind of highlight how immigration has played a role in my life. I was born in America, so child of an immigrant, and it was weird growing up because I was never allowed to speak English. I got hit all the time, and I've got some cousins tuning in right now. Hi, everybody. And we can all attest to the same thing. We got hit every time we used an English word. And, for the longest time, we couldn't understand it. And my mom kept saying, when you go to kindergarten, then you can start using English. And I realize now, I think it was just a fear of losing culture. Like she just didn't want us to lose that part of ourselves and felt like, at some point we would just catch up. So I thought that was really interesting. And then I was kind of thinking through, well, as a child of immigrants, you know, what is it like growing up here in America and having to navigate through things for the first time? And for me, it was, I mean, the school that I went to, I mean, it's not like they had the means to move to any community, right? They went where they had to go. And my mom lived in a very condensed home with a lot of family members. And yeah, I went to Lusinger High School in LA. And I remember when I graduated back in 2005, the statistics were really alarming when I got older and was starting to realize more and more what it meant to be a college graduate. And so just to give you some backstory about Lusinger High School, at the time, my graduating class started with 1,000 students. And by the time June came along, we had about 500 students make it to the end. So 500 students just disappeared somehow or went off to alternative ed, or, you know, I don't know. But of the 500, I remember a list coming out of students that were going to college. And on that list was about 50 students, but it also listed community college. So community of the 500, 50 are saying, yep, I'm committed to going to community college, or a 4-year private, you know, UC, what have you. And of that list, I realized that I am one of 8 students in my graduating class who actually graduated with an undergraduate degree from that school. Yeah. And when I think about that, I think, I know I'm not the only one with that experience. And it does come down to luck, I feel like. And I think Susan said this earlier, but I genuinely feel that nobody gets to where they are without somebody to help pull them up or with support. And I definitely would not be, you know, a college grad today. I have 2 masters and a doctorate. I'm the first in my family to do all of those things. And I definitely wouldn't have done it without the support of others. And for me, it was one teacher who made a difference in my life. One, that's all it took, who saw my potential and changed my whole life trajectory. And then from there, you know, you continue, right? I feel like in some ways I've adopted that survivalist mentality from my mom. You just push, you go, you do what you have to do. But in thinking through, how do you hold on to your sense of community, or you know, keep with your culture? You know, in LA, there's not a lot of Vietnamese people, but I will say we always congregated in Little Saigon. That's where all the Vietnamese people are. That's where all the good Viet food is. If you're ever paying for a bowl of pho that's more than $8, then you're getting ripped off, and it's probably not that great. But having said that, yeah, I just felt like that's where we met people, and that's where we went often, like every single weekend. And going back to LA, I felt a sense of community with Vietnamese people. Even if I didn't know a Vietnamese elder, if I was walking down the street and I saw a Vietnamese person, I would say hello. And it was the norm. So I felt like tied to that community still all the way up till high school. And it was strange. It wasn't until I broke, just for a brief moment in time, broke ties with my mom because I wanted to go to college. And then we reunited when I graduated from college, and this, you know, was trying to prepare for a wedding. That I realized that my mom and I had very different perspectives of identity in America. So for Vietnamese people, it's custom that you have a very large wedding. I'm talking like 1,000 people. It's crazy. So we decided, my husband, who's also Vietnamese American, 250. That's like the largest we'll go. And we thought that was large. She thought that was insulting. And so then, you know, of course, we're fighting over details. But the one thing that came to me was she wanted a 7-course traditional Vietnamese meal. I mean, fancy, right? And of course, we're paying for everything. And I just remember arguing with her about this, and I was like, no, Mom, we want them to have a choice: steak, chicken, vegetarian, like Americans do. And she said out loud, why do you want an American wedding? You're not American. And I was like, what are you talking about? I was born here. I'm definitely American. She was like, no, you're not. You're Vietnamese. And it was in that moment I didn't realize that my mom thought this, actually. and then we hung up and made up, and it was fine. But yeah, I'm learning more and more about how my mom perceives race in America and how she tries to navigate through things. But it's been very interesting to experience.
All right, so how has immigration played a role? I was born here. Child of immigrants. So I think it's played a role in kind of, like Kelly, your mom said you're Vietnamese. My parents said I'm American, and so because I'm American, I should know how to do this. So like navigating systems. It's like I'm figuring it out for the first time at my age today. And whatever new system I'm encountering, I'm figuring it out. Back then, it wasn't, people they wanted you to speak English back then. And back then, I mean the 70s. And so it wasn't encouraged that I speak Japanese. And like June, I lost my language. My primary language growing up was Japanese. And my mom said she was so worried about me going to school because I was going to be the first American kid to go to school in the United States from this family. So she was really worried about that. So she, Sesame Street was my teacher and figuring that out. I think professionally, because I saw how my parents did with parent conferences or struggled through parent conferences, and either I was using my broken Japanese to help translate, or my mom having a kind of a partial understanding of what was going on. That's probably why when I started teaching, I taught in LA, and the majority of my students came from Spanish-speaking homes, and I was determined to provide a welcoming space for my students and their parents. And so I studied Spanish. I took lots of classes. I went to school in Mexico and Spain just to kind of get this, so that I was able to have conversations with families, because I wanted them to feel like they were welcome with me. Even though I'm not from a Spanish-speaking country, I wanted them to know that as their child's teacher, I speak your language. And so that's how it impacted me professionally.
So as an immigrant, I felt it keenly. I remember coming here, and in my third grade classroom, I was always that kid in the corner. There's the red group and the blue group, the yellow group and green group, and there was me in the corner. And I learned English by, running cards, these vocabulary cards, through this magnetic reader. Ball, apple, pencil. My favorite one was Mr. Schneider is my principal. I will never forget that phrase. And I just always wanted to be like everyone else. I didn't want to be the person who couldn't speak English. I didn't want to be the person whose parents or whose mom really dressed weird, talked weird, and gave me weird food. And growing up as an immigrant with a fairly traditional mom, I hate to say this, but I was embarrassed a lot. I didn't want to bring friends home, and I always went to other people's homes. I didn't want to, I hid my food sometimes because I was embarrassed to show my food, especially when, people would think, oh, what is that? So I went home hungry all the time. And just to not make my mom upset, I would literally dump out my lunch. And she would always be like, wow, you must be so hungry. Did I not pack you enough food? Please don't pack me more food. But yeah, even in high school, I think it took me a long time to finally feel like, you know what, my English is just as good as anyone else's, but it took me that long. And we made fun of each other, like those of us who were immigrants. We called each other fobs. We made fun of each other and said, you're made in Taiwan too. Like every label back then was made in Taiwan. So I was also made in Taiwan. And then how does that translate to my professional life? Well, I feel it. I feel it keenly. I feel it keenly in in the students that I work with, or I used to work with when I was a classroom teacher, when their immigrant experience, and I always wanted a space for them to feel like it's okay to be bicultural. It's great to have two languages. And even now, as I am on the PTA at my kid's school, I'm always fighting for the immigrant voices experience. I want parents to feel welcome at the school, because I can tell that they don't feel welcome. So yeah, but back to, I think it was Kelly's point, like the supports. In hindsight, I do have to admit that I benefited from the model minority youth or model minority experience, because in looking back at the opportunities that were given to me, I do wonder, did they give me the opportunity because I was Asian? Did that one teacher in 6th grade say, you know what, she has potential, and put me in all honors classes in junior high when I had no business being in honors English, no business being in honors social studies? I couldn't even read half of the text when I got into junior high, but did I benefit from just being Asian? And did my other peers who were not Asian not get the same benefit?
Thank you, everyone. As usual, Evelyn's provided a nice segue into the next question, which is, have you ever been a victim, or maybe not necessarily a victim, of prejudice and stereotypes? If so, what can you share about how this made you feel?
So I think I wanted to share a powerful experience I've had this week. So this week I was reading the news about Corky Lee. He's an Asian American photographer who passed away after dealing with COVID. But he was famous because he had these photographs of Chinese Americans recreating from the 1800s the photographs when the railroad was completed. And in that story, you know, Chinese Americans did the bulk of the labor, you know, in really low paid labor, right, to construct that railroad. But the celebratory pictures were all of the white men in the pictures. And so Corky Lee recreated those pictures with the descendants of the railroad workers. And he passed away this week. But it was powerful for me because I reflect a lot on kind of invisible culture and how the histories of that we have in the US get reflected in how we perceive our experiences, and also how the broader culture also treats us. And so this relates to this question, I promise, because that's something that's important to me in my professional life. And my experiences, I think, with prejudice often have to do with very well-meaning people not being aware of that invisible culture. And for me, that invisible culture is sometimes the sense of Asian Americans being seen as a model minority of achieving a lot, but we're never quite accepted. You know, if we're a little too loud, if we stick out a little too much, if we, you know, do something beyond being studious and, you know, high achieving, that's not, people get uncomfortable with that. And there's kind of, I have a feel, my perception of it is there's kind of an erasure then that happens where, you know, you don't really want folks like that, right? And so I've experienced that throughout my career, and it's with my friends. It's just, you know, it's not an evil thing. It's really with like folks who don't think about it that much. And a vignette for that is I serve on a lot of, or have served on a lot of diversity committees in the university in my career. And in one of the universities I was in, you know, inadvertently someone said, well, you know, we need to improve representation in the university across different measures of diversity. But, you know, like the Asian American, the Asian sector of that doesn't count, you know? And I was like, whoa, like, hold up. Like, I understand that the university's official rules about it have erased Asian American diversity, right? But I'm going to be in this committee, and and say something about that, right? And often that comes with a bit of professional risk because of that, potentially being seen as, not a great colleague or rabble rousing, or, or being ostracized, or, or being someone who just complains or something like that, right? So it's a constant tension, is like, being a good colleague and conscientious and high achieving, and also making it in your career for your families and, things like that, but also battling against the US history of just kind of positioning Asians in that way overall in the narrative, right? So, skipping ahead to the last question, my, advice to folks, is like, don't be the railroad workers, like, who get erased from the photograph, right? Like, I love the hard work, but I'll probably always, speak up, or try to speak up in things.
What you said, June, really resonated with me a lot. I felt a lot of times very visible, but yet very invisible in many, many professional situations. And I really, the definition of diversity in universities really bothers me. So I've experienced quite some blatant racial, I guess, slurs, but also a lot of microaggression type of behaviors. I want to share a couple of things. One is, if you go to when we have a chance to go to campus, if you go to my office, you'll see my diploma kind of prominently placed on my wall. And, it wasn't there before. The motivation, how that happened was, so when I was an assistant professor, I was teaching, reading development and how to teach reading, because that's my area, language and literacy development. And when you do that, you have to talk a lot about language, English language, English writing system. And one of the students asked me, how do I know what I'm talking about? It's because, the details, I was talking about something that's counterintuitive, because, adults who speak English, they are so proficient or automatic, they don't think about some things, right? So that really kind of challenged me in terms of my professional credential, in terms of how I look. And I also realized they see me forever as a foreigner. When I just came here to the US, I was a foreigner and I was totally fine. That was my identity. But then when I became the US citizen, have lived here long enough, and just feeling that I was considered as a foreigner, and also really my kind of professional knowledge was questioned. I thought, okay, I need to put up something that shows that I know what I'm talking about. The other piece that I try not to be sensitive, because I think people come from really good place, is that whenever I'm around on campus, or whenever I have, conversations with people about what I do, and I work at UCI, people automatically by default assume that I'm a graduate student. And this has happened ever since when I was young, and even to pretty recently, which is unbelievable given my age, but it has happened so many times. And when it happens once, you think that, okay, but it happens so many times, it really starts bothering you. So, initially, these pieces, when things happen so many times over and over, they really kind of, these irked me, because I was experiencing the things that my husband was not. He's Asian American, he's male. The only difference I see is he's male, I'm not. And I was experiencing all these things that he was not experiencing. I was experiencing many things that my colleagues, when I was in graduate school, PhD program, I was experiencing a lot of things in the Cambridge area. Whereas my friend from Netherlands or other parts of the world, they did not experience any of those I was experiencing. So it really initially very, very much made me angry. Why am I exposed to, all these pieces when my colleagues are not. But over time, though, it really got me thinking about the pieces that kind of my assumptions, my interactions with people, and also got me worried about the experiences my kids have. Like June, what you shared, right? My kids grew up in Florida, where they were really the single Asian Americans. They were always asked who they were. So it got me really kind of be sensitive about their experiences. And Evelyn and June, I intentionally packed their lunch with rice and dumplings so that they become very comfortable with who they are. I told them, you're Asian American. People, depending on where you are, a lot of times people will see you as a foreigner, even though you're not. You should get comfortable with who you are, being that way. So I feel that, it really could relate to your experience, and I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Young. I would say I'm a pretty easygoing person, but I've definitely felt aggressions, comments by people, or like just by experiences where they make you feel belittled, small, or even insignificant. So I definitely feel like I have faced prejudice and stereotypes, but maybe not as blatant as others have. Um, but it just really just drives me to try to be a better person, and I would never want to make someone else feel small or invisible. So that's sort of how I have experienced prejudice and stereotypes.
So for me, the last incident I recall was when a colleague said to me that Asians aren't really considered minorities anyway. And at the time, I didn't have the ability, I want to say, to have that courageous conversation, because just like June mentioned earlier, I was fearful of some sort of retaliation, or even thinking this is career suicide. And so I just politely smiled, and I didn't know what else to do. And I regret it a lot. But, I feel like these moments happen really to a lot of people, if anything. And you have to pick your battles, because if every day you were choosing to fight back on the microaggressions or these snide comments, or whatever it is, it just becomes so exhausting. And so I think that that's one thing. And then for me, it's kind of strange, like when I think of accomplishments or anything like that, strangely, whenever something is achieved for me, there's also a level of deep shame. Like, it's very odd. It's like I can't do too well. Because if I do too well, right, I can't talk about it. There's weird shame that comes from that. And I think honestly, the more that I explore that, it comes from, imposter syndrome, also lacking that sense of belonging in some of these spaces. When you walk in the room and you don't identify with anybody there, just thinking, do I really belong here? Did I earn this spot? Is my voice, valid, or is what I have to say of any value? Will I contribute here? Do you expect me to contribute a lot? And if I do, then there's that deep shame that's associated with it. And so it's just like a weird dynamic. But I think just to lean into what everybody's saying here, I think it's almost because I have very similar experiences being Vietnamese American. When you're here, you almost feel like you don't belong because of how you're treated on a daily basis at times too. But then when I go back to Vietnam, they can tell I'm from America. Just opening my mouth, they're like, oh, you're from America. Sing me a song in English. And even if you try to speak in Vietnamese, they can tell you're not getting the accents right. And my husband and I were talking about how we don't actually have very fond memories of when we visit Vietnam, because there's always this notion that when you're born in America and you're Vietnamese, you've lost your roots. And it's something to be like embarrassed about. But then when you're here, you have to assimilate. And if you're first in your family to do anything, you have to do it well and you have to do it fast. And so I feel like all of those things are tying into trying to succeed in different roles now, and especially in roles of leadership. It does, you know, just as all of you have mentioned already, I hate, and I recognize all the time when I'm receiving a compliment, right? Like a compliment that's really a diss. Like, why is it that when we occupy these spaces and we share ideas or we present, I don't know why, but sometimes my colleagues will say things like, wow, I appreciate your ideas and I just love how articulate you are. I don't know what it is, but I keep thinking, why would I not be articulate? I don't even know what you mean by that you had this perception of me maybe before I started speaking, that you thought that was a compliment, but really it was a compliment, like you just insulted me. And so it's weird to navigate through, but a lot of your stories also resonate with me and what we're currently experiencing as well. But in some ways it's also affirming. So I appreciate how vulnerable everybody's being.
As for racism or prejudice or stereotypes, I feel like when I was younger, there was more examples of, you know, random people calling me a Jap, or, you know, just like yelling things out of cars. I don't have that so much now, I guess, because I'm an adult. But I just remember more of it being a child or a teenager, just random people being able to say things like that to me, or pull their eyes back. As in a greater sense, I'm still wondering why, like, our former president can use racist terminology and get away with it. So it's almost as if racism toward Asian Americans, or the terminologies used against us, is the last like acceptable form of racism. You know, why is it that he could say Kung flu and China virus? You know, even things like, why is the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's still celebrated? Why is that still considered, you know, one of our greatest pieces of cinema, when I cannot watch that without being horrified? I cannot watch it without being horrified. And so I think it's just kind of being in that, you know, middle group again. I'm not sure what I can do, what I can get away with. So I think that it's a lot more subtle sometimes now, but it's also seen as acceptable.
Okay, so my husband and I were pretty much academic nomads. And, you know, having grown up in California where there's a lot more diversity, I don't remember hearing a whole lot of racist remarks, or overtly or covertly. But when we moved to Missouri, wow, well, let's just say that's a whole different world. I think June, having been brought up in the Midwest, he could probably relate. There just aren't a whole lot of Asians out there. It's a pretty black and white part of the country. And I remember the first day when I drove onto my new school site, a very well-intentioned veteran teacher pulled me aside and she gave me this warning. Just to let you know, you might want to be careful. There are KKK members around this community. And I mean, she meant really well, but at the same time, I felt like, why are you telling me this? Do you know people who are part of the KKK? Do you know families? Are you trying to protect me, or is this like fair warning to you? There's gonna be racism, just to let you know, that kind of deal. And I also remember one of the secretaries, when I first met her, she was surprised that my last name was Young, Y-O-U-N-G. And she said, "Is your husband also from the Orient?" I held my tongue, but I almost wanted to say, yes, sir. And I came to school on a rickshaw today, but I didn't. I wanted to just like, no. we're not from the Orient. You don't use that word. And then there was a time when I was sitting at a car repair shop. I was just waiting and sitting there with my teacher's manual, my Houghton Mifflin ELA teacher's manual, and I'm flipping through the pages and trying to jot down notes. And then this gentleman came in, and now he looked at it and he said, "Oh, are you trying to learn English?" And I said, "No, I'm a teacher. I teach English." And then there was that one very blatant time when I was having a teachers conference, and one of the mothers who didn't like what I had to share about her son and told me to go back to my own country. So that's that part of the world. And when we talk about why there's that acceptance of that microaggression, and I know Bettina Love does not like the word microaggression, and I can now see why, because none of those aggressions were micro. I remember it distinctly. It still impacts my life. It still reminds me that I am not accepted in this country, and people like me are not accepted in this country. And when our ex-president can say something like the Kung flu, it is raising up these people's same sentiment that they don't belong here. And even if we have, for those of us who were born in this country, who are second generation, who like my kids who are 1/2 fourth generation, they are still not completely visible, and they still totally don't belong.
Wow. Ooh, thank you. It's getting deep. So that's actually another segue into our next question. There's a lot of heightened awareness about anti-racism, racial justice from the panelists. Like, have you seen any meaningful changes or engaged in any type of dialogue within the Asian American community? So we'll start with you.
I know in my friend circles, we've been talking about challenging ourselves as Asian Americans to make sure that we do not fall prey to the model minority positioning. What I mean by that is that I want to harken back to something Evelyn said, in that we have to recognize as an Asian American community the privileges that we have, right? That maybe other racial and ethnic minority groups don't enjoy, while at the same time we're sharing these experiences of not being accepted either, right? And the model minority kind of conundrum is that America will usually say, hold up Asian Americans as a generic group to say, look how successful they've been. They just follow the rules. If you just follow the rules like they do, you can be successful too. And really pit us against other allies, right? People of color, right? And particularly my BIPOC allies, right? Like, so there's this kind of pitting against that can happen. But then at the same time, a lot of my Asian American friends fall into that kind of narrative of like, I'm working hard, I'm doing my thing, I'm like, achieving the American dream. And so I'm following the rules, but never really realizing that there's a kind of a ceiling. There's kind of a glass ceiling of acceptance that they might not really be accepted at the end of the day, right? And this broader narrative is just happening in my friend circles. It's happening in the public pages. Andrew Yang, who was one of the presidential candidates, he had written a public article, which was essentially telling Asian Americans, like, just follow the rules, like keep contributing and working hard, and then the reaction to it was like, no, man, like just within this panel, there's all these stories of like, that's not true, right? And so I'd say it's an ongoing challenge, and that my challenge for the Asian American community is to make sure that we are allies, right? That we don't take the privileges that we're afforded and say we're a part of mainstream America, and then forget about social justice, right? There's a group of Asian Americans in our communities that might feel that way, And I want us to like challenge ourselves to not to fall into that. And at the same time to understand that our experiences are different, and that we have to find ways to be allies for folks who are also striving for social justice, right? Through our difference. So, you know, I can speak more to that, but all I'll say, it's an ongoing conversation with my friend groups and social circles, is like, how do we do that? And I'm committed to just keep trying, right?
Yeah, you know, I would share what's we've been discussing in our family. You know, we've been talking about the how it's framed a lot of times in the media as like a whites and blacks, kind of that dichotomy. That's really the attention that has been paid given. And you know, we're talking about how this is so limiting in terms of the diversity, you know, inclusive of thinking about sexual orientation, disability, you know, all the other kind of aspects of it, you know, cultural identity, all those other aspects of it. And we were also talking about the fact that, you know, some of these kind of a narrative out there is actually repeated within our community too. Just recognizing that and then not repeating that, right? And I'm not raising this to blame anyone, but you know, I think it's just recognition of that. Is I think it's a first step, because you know I'm trying not to reveal too much, but you know my my kids' grandparents tend to have some very strong ideas, and my kids, you know, bring that up, and we talk about it, and I think that's really important, and to actually talk about, you know, different views about it, like very honestly.
Young. So I can't speak for the Asian American like pan-ethnically, but I can speak about the Vietnamese American community. I know there's a big divide between the older generation and the younger generation. Like the older generation, right? Like they want to reject anything that is close to communism or socialism, right? Because that's what they escaped from. And so even though they may find, you know, the past president a heinous person as a character, as a person, if his policies reject communism in a way, they're going to be again, you know, for that. But then but then what's happening is they're being fed a lot of, you know, fake news, a lot of lies from these podcasts and these YouTubers. I mean, our older generation, they have access to YouTube now, right? Or they have access to Facebook, and they don't have the media literacy or critical literacy to know, even if it's on the internet, it's not true, right? So there's a lot of tension between the older and the younger generation, because the older generation just says like, we hate communism, and we're going to stand against the person. We're going to stand behind the person who's going to reject it for us. Whereas the younger generation knows that they're being fed fake news and being fed really these racist, you know, messages saying like, well, blame it on, you know, this group, or blame it on this group, because that's why, you know, you need to be afraid and you need to be careful about this group and that group. But the younger generation, they actually are trying to like gather together and try to debunk these myths that are being fed to the older generation. And I think the problem is that there's also a language barrier, right? So we actually have a lot of good people in the community who are able to translate between both Vietnamese and English, and they're trying to create materials that can actually be shared among parents and their children, so they can understand the importance of Black Lives Matter and the importance of getting out to vote and the importance of, you know, standing behind our allies. And I think I see a lot of that movement changing, but this community is still very much impacted by the war, right? Like there's always this memory of the war and what it represents, and the children having to understand the trauma that their parents went through, or the older generation that went through. And so it's this double burden of like trying to forge your own political identity in America, but at the same time trying to heal your parents and the older generation from what they come from. So I think that's what's happening among the Vietnamese American community.
Thank you, Hui. So actually, when I was thinking about this question, I had the same thoughts. And well, there's two Vietnamese people here, and we have the same thoughts, so it must be right. Just kidding. But I will say, yeah, that's what I noticed too. Even within my own family, a lot of the older generation are pro-Trump, and for the life of me, I couldn't understand it until actually somebody explained that really it was Trump's stance on communism and China, and literally taking down China, right? Because of everything that they had lost. So, I just wanted to say, yes, that's also something I wanted to share, but I also wanted to share that I felt like I'm seeing a different younger generation. You know, I'm part of that generation, and I just feel like we're pushing back in different ways, more humane ways, and through storytelling. And that's a cultural difference that I'm noticing too. Like here, I feel comfortable sharing stories, sharing personal experiences, and feeling affirmed and validated. And within academia, sometimes it's not, like those lived experiences it doesn't have as much weight as data. And I almost feel like you need both, though. You need the stories to make sense of the data, because the numbers themselves don't tell the full story. And so, along those lines, I was having a hard time trying to figure out a way to talk to my mom about what was happening with George Floyd. And, it's a very sensitive topic. I already shared earlier. She definitely doesn't talk about history or background or anything like that because it's rude, right? And so I thought, I wonder if I started asking her questions about, what she sees going on now. And at the time she was working in Florida for NASA. And, I was just asking her if there were any racial tensions, things of that nature. And what I was finding for myself that was useful were YouTube videos of other younger generations modeling how to have a conversation with older generation individuals in your native language. And it actually helped me because I was thinking, I don't know how to communicate this in a way that still comes off as respectful and not disrespectful to my mom, because she still comes from a culture that, you respect your elders, you're not supposed to question your elders, and all of that. And so I felt like I was seeing more of that. So I'm seeing a lot of the younger generation push back, but in smarter ways. And the best way that I've seen so far is by positioning yourself in that lens. And so what I mean by that is, for me, the moment that changed my mom's perspective just a little bit and had her opening up to talking about race was when I asked her, I said, Mom, I've gotten pulled over by the police 3 times. And, I just want to ask you, were you ever afraid? Like, were you ever afraid of when I would ever get pulled over by a police officer? Like, did you ever have to talk to me about it or coach me in some way to kind of get through that situation? And she was like, no. And I was like, well, why do you think that is? And she was like, what do you mean? Police officers are here to protect you. And, so we started on this journey of kind of exploring that. And I said, well, we grew up in Gardena. Our neighbors were Black and brown. They were like family to us. And I said, did you know that that's not common, that there are families out there, personal family friends of ours, that have to talk to someone as young as my son, a 5-year-old, about how to deal with a police officer because they're fearful even of what that interaction could be. And for her, it was weird. Immediately, she could try to relate as a mother. Like, well, why would they have to do something like that? Why would they have to be afraid? So then we kind of approached it in a more humanistic way, because if I put myself in that position, my mom was finally trying to understand, well, that doesn't seem right to me. Like at first she kept saying, well, maybe these are just accidents. Maybe police officers keep accidentally shooting Black people. Like she was genuinely just thought like, there's definitely no, racial divide. There's, none of that. And she just kept thinking accidents. And I kept saying, well, let's look at the numbers. And more stories every week kept coming out. And so we started having more and more conversations, but in this way, it was safe. It was safe for her to think those things through. And then she'd go back to work and have more conversations with her colleagues that are not white. And she started asking more questions. I'm really proud of her. But I feel like I am seeing that a lot more. A lot of my friends are questioning more the older generation and thinking through, why do you feel that way? Strangely, Susan, when they heard, like I heard some of my family friends say, my father actually agrees with Kung Flu. You should call it the China virus because it came from China. It was very strange, the rationale, but then we had to, take a step back and have these one-on-one conversations in seemingly respectful ways to even be heard. But I am seeing progress in that way. There's a shift generationally.
Heightened awareness. Kelly, you mentioned the younger generation, and I have to agree with you. I think the younger generation of Asian Americans are really branching out, which I'm so excited about. I think, like I keep saying back then, but there were so few routes that were acceptable. But I just love seeing the risks that young Asian Americans are taking today. When I first hopped onto the Zoom, I said, oh my goodness, I'm in such great company. And this doesn't happen very often among the Asian American community because then it's considered too ethnic. So if you have too many Asians in one group, it's considered too ethnic and it's not considered mainstream. And so I'm so pleased that the younger generation doesn't, they just do it. I'm really impressed. Back when UC Irvine was on campus, I love the fact that America's Best Dance Crew was the Asian American group. I thought that was amazing. And even if you don't like Crazy Rich Asians, okay. But to me, it was to be able to see a story that was on mainstream cinema. That was a huge deal for me because growing up, if I saw Asians in a movie, it was in Japanese. And so to see an entire cast like that was groundbreaking for me. And I love the fact that the younger generation of Asian Americans doesn't give an F, they just do it. And I'm really impressed with the younger generation. As I think Hui and Kelly, you mentioned the media that our older generation consume. That's definitely an issue. I definitely see that because, like you said, of the YouTube and the videos that are available to them, the message is definitely, there's a message that doesn't necessarily match the message that I believe in.
Oh, sorry, I was unmuted the whole time. I hope I didn't laugh out loud at any point. So I agree, and yet I don't know if I completely agree with the fact that our Asian community or the youth is being driven to accomplish something. I do find that there's more of I embrace my culture, and I am proud of being a Chinese or Filipino or Japanese or Korean American, and I celebrate that identity. But I wonder, in especially in the last 4 years, as racial tension arose, there was a huge movement among the Black and Brown community, among the youth of the Black and Brown community, to say enough is enough. And there wasn't really that same drive among the Asian American youth or the Asian community to say enough is enough. And in fact, to this day, I feel like, when are you going to become passionate about fighting for your own visibility in the culture, in the American culture? We've gone from people of color to BIPOC, Black and Brown Indigenous people of color. How hard would it be to throw an A in there to include the Asian community? You can even include the Arab community just by throwing the letter A into that BIPOC. And our experiences there are only 6 of us on this panel, but just imagine there are what, 4.6 billion Asian people in the world. How exclusive to leave out the A in that acronym. And yet we're okay with being visible, and yet we're okay being silent, and we're okay to say, well, yes, we have kind of succeeded and we shouldn't fight for anything else. And I look at my kids who are that age, they are teenagers. I have 13 and a 16 and a 17-year-old who, I don't know, in the last year, and yes, they participated in, protests or, whatever the school did, they did as well. But it wasn't like they're heartfelt about it. And they're not, I don't feel like they have that passion or the drive to say, I want to fight for something. And I think that has been the demise of our own people, really. Like, we just don't fight enough. We just let it go. We're good students. We do well. We are accomplished, and we're happy with what we have. But by golly, if we actually asserted ourselves, that's just not us. Why is that? Right? Why is that? And I was just looking at statistics. The percentage of Asian Americans who obtain undergrad degrees, we make up about what, 60%? 50, high 50, 60% of college graduates. And yet the percentage of Asian American leaders in any industry is minimal. You would think that for such a highly educated group that we would actually get somewhere, but to June's point, there is a huge bamboo ceiling. We can't get there. We can't break that barrier. And if in any field we should be breaking that barrier is in higher education, because golly, we do have a whole lot of degrees behind us. But among all of the college presidents in the United States, Asian Americans make up 2%. So at what point do we say enough is enough? And I get that, we personify the modern minority myth. I get that. And people are saying, well, you're already successful. But don't forget that there are 4.6 billion Asians who are not equally successful. There are a ton of people who struggle just like everyone else, but they're not recognized. Their stories are not told. They may be pulled over just like Black and brown teenagers are, but their stories don't make the news. We're just, in general, invisible.
Okay, thank you. Because we are running out of time and we might want to have a few minutes for questions. I'm going to combine the last 2 questions. They're closely related, and I think you'll see that. So one of the questions was, during your K-12 experience, do you recall learning about your specific ethnicity? And then the last question is, what advice would you give to teachers, lecturers, and professors regarding Asian American students?
Ooh, yeah. So the short answer is no, never. So so it's never really happened. And actually, this is, to Susan's point and Evelyn's point, this is actually the first time in my life that I've actually sat in a panel in a community of Asian American peers and us actually talking about these things, honestly. So I'm super thankful. So that's the answer to that question. In terms of advice, I just want to thank you all, because what I want to point out for the audience or the attendees, that there's diversity in our thinking, right? And Hui also mentioned, it's not a pan-Asian, it's not a generic Asian thing, right? There are Trump supporters, there are non-Trump supporters, there are folks who are still espousing racist views, and there are folks who are trying, evolving and thinking, right? There are folks who are thinking about raising our own community's visibility. right? And then there are folks thinking about how do we become allies and join in the greater movement. Like there's just a lot of diversity. So if I were to take anything away from this, it's that we have a unique perspective, and then there's a lot of diversity even within that uniqueness as well. And then I think the challenge, I really love what you're saying, Evelyn, and actually like I resonate with it because that is going to be a core tension for me, and I think for a lot of members of our different communities, is figuring out how to, number one, advocate for ourselves and increase our visibility. But at the same time, I firmly believe that justice for everybody is justice for us as well. And so I think the Asian American community, my advice to y'all is like figuring out how can I honor our families and ancestors and communities while joining in on the collective justice that we're striving for in this country as well. Because it's kind of this like weird, everybody, all the different minority groups in this country are fighting for visibility and justice. And we need to find the way to do that where we're not fighting against each other, right? But honoring kind of everyone's struggle, right? So there's a unique struggle that each of us faces, and then there's a collective struggle. And so I think that's my advice, is like figuring out how to think of that duality in your own actions going forward is kind of going to be important for us.
I think June said it so well, and I'm not sure if I can add more. I mean, personally, what I can share is that this is a really kind of important topic at a very personal level. When I came to UCI, what's been, not only at UCI, but in other places, as I mentioned, the definition of diversity bothered me quite a bit. And it really struck me here when I came to UCI, because half of the students we serve are of Asian ancestry. But if you look at the leadership, you really don't see that. It's not just UCI, but if you look at the UC system, you just don't see that. So, part of my, so when I was given the opportunity to think about the current position, administrative position as a, senior associate dean, I really had to think about it, because I really love doing research. And I'm a very private person, reserved person. And I wasn't sure about taking the role, but then I also really wanted to, I thought that, just being, for some students, seeing some Asian female at a leadership position, I thought that that could be potentially one way. So I thought, okay, I will give that a try. So, it's, I think it's just, trying our own individual ways, but also collectively, as June said, I think it's really important. One thing that I want to, perhaps talk about is, the heterogeneity among Asian Americans within this huge category, right? Not only in terms of language, culture, geographics, all those pieces, but also within that community, there's, continuum of Asian American experience, right? As you saw in this panel. So, that's the students that we serve in this community. There's Asian international students, Asian American students, but we tend to categorize them together, and they should not be, they bring so much different political, historical, cultural experiences and histories. And I think recognizing that would be an important place to start.
To be honest, I almost pulled out the panel because I didn't think my stories were important. But after having heard everybody today, I just want to also echo June that I feel very privileged and honored to be part of this panel. And hopefully I am giving the voice to the voiceless, as Evelyn said, by sharing today. But growing up, for me, it was mainly celebrations, right? Like Chinese New Year. And even Chinese New Year, I don't think, I feel like it should be Lunar New Year because more than one culture celebrates this New Year. But also just the war, right? Like Vietnamese people are known for the war. And so that's just these two dichotomies, like either you're a celebratory event or you're this war that, a lot of people still have conflicting feelings about. So that's what I learned about my culture in schools. So I definitely want to push and advocate for more nuances and different histories, right? That's why I think this push for ethnic studies in California school systems is a good move, and that's something that I'm hoping that would enrich everybody's understanding of each other's cultures, and that to know that California or America is not just this one perspective, but it is made up of immigrants really of from different cultures. And I'm probably preaching to the choir, but just like we are not our stereotypes, right? Um, we need, and Asian, like I guess because this idea about this affirmative action and at Harvard and other places where they're saying like, well, they have no personality. They're always the same. Like they're always like overachievers and doing this and that just for resume building. And I want to debunk that because I think we're all unique individuals with all these different goals and these interesting histories. And it really takes, a teacher who is diligent and who is also just to listen and to draw students out of their shells. And I think putting the effort to recognize each of us as individuals is important, as well as to understand the common struggles that we may have because of our cultural backgrounds is important as well. So really just, we are not our stereotypes, is all I can say. Thanks.
Yeah, so I had a realization maybe just a couple months ago that I really didn't know anything about my cultural background. And I only had that realization because I wanted to tell my kids about Vietnamese people. And then when I thought about that, I was like, I don't know much about Vietnamese people. And so now I'm at a place with my own family where we can dive deeper with those questions. And, my mom started sharing more about her upbringing, but also that, in Vietnam, we come from kings and queens, and it's a third world country, but look at the engineering and the architecture and, the advanced mathematics, even for a third world country. And it sounded weird to me that she even presented it that way, because I was thinking, why do you say even for? Right? Like as though just because poor people, like we're poor, right? We don't have much to offer in these fields. And so I felt like even then I wanted to explore that further, with my own kids and thinking through what that meant and how really every one of us from different cultures, whether it's third world country or first world, we all have something to contribute. Now imagine the rich conversations we could have if everybody really had a seat at the table. And that's what I'm starting to realize. And so, for me, echoing what everybody else said, I found that college was really where I found my identity. And that was because I started learning more about myself, my culture, taking those Asian studies courses, having the historical background of what was happening. My mom kept saying, the French took over. And I was like, well, I don't even understand what's happening there. And why do you know French? And all of that. And then I start thinking, though, when we think of underrepresented minority people, how many of them really get to go to college to that extent where they get to even take those classes to learn more about themselves, to affirm their identity? And that's where I feel like the injustice is as well. And, Evelyn, I hear what you're saying in terms of advocating to make sure that we're, unseen, or I'm sorry, more visible. And in my mind, I keep thinking, of what June is saying as well. And I definitely am feeling like it's that metaphor of, you go into a neighborhood and there's one house that's burning right now, and that's the house that's on fire. And we need to address the house that's on fire, even though there's a risk of other houses catching on fire. There's one right now that's of immediate concern, and that's for our Black community. And so in the work that I'm doing, I'm really trying to think through strategic and systematic ways to figuring out, not only to be an ally, but what does it mean to be a co-conspirator? And how do we make change that we can both see and feel, as my good friend Acacia has said to me, and because that's what's needed, right? And so, you know, just to answer that question, but you know, I don't know if I have advice that's in addition to anything, but in my mind, I just keep thinking, I think affirmation goes a long way. Being able to hear each other and affirm with each other these experiences provides that sense of belonging. And I know that seeing these committee members, for some I'm just meeting today, I know that this is a bonding experience for us. And that's because we're able to affirm with each other and explore these issues further. So my only addition to all the advice given is, you know, we really do have to listen with as much passion as, you know, when we want to be heard, right? And I'm not sure if there's a lot of listening going on, more than people feeling like there's just too many egos in the room sometimes. And so, yeah, but again, I echo what everybody else said. What an honor and a privilege to be here with you all. And I'm so glad to get to know you all better as well.
Oh, I'm speechless to be able to participate with this group of people. I'm just to hear all of our experiences and how diverse our experiences have been, yet we all have very similar common threads of the way other people have seen us. And so I think just when Evelyn, you mentioned the model minority and how knowing that as an Asian American woman, I probably was given the benefit of the doubt more often than not, because I was studious, I was quiet, I followed directions, and so I was probably given the benefit of the doubt. But that's why I'm just so excited about this group of people behind us. Maybe they're not organizing, Evelyn, the way you eloquently said. And I really appreciate that idea that they are not angry enough right now. I'm just, at this point, I'm just happy to see them. I'm happy that they're visible in all different career fields. Young, I'm so glad you took on the leadership position, because I believe it is beneficial for Asians to see a female Asian in a position of power, but it's also important for non-Asians to see a female Asian in a position of power. So thank you for taking on that position. And that's what I want my teachers to know, is that their Asian students are not a monolith. They come with a diversity of experiences, a diversity of understanding, a diversity of skills. But we do share some common histories, some common things.
Thank you, Susan. So, in looking at this question, it says, during your K-12 experience, do you recall learning about your specific ethnicity? I think we can all safely say that when we look at the history of the United States, we can recall 4 or 5 things related to Asian Americans. 1, the Transcontinental Railroad. 2, the Chinese Exclusion Act. 3, the Japanese internment camp. 4, the Vietnam War. 5, the Korean War. And maybe most recently, North Korea, right? None of which paints a happy picture of Asian Americans. So that is people's introduction of what Asian culture is. They are the enemy. And our history is so lost. And I appreciate this comment that Howard put into the chat about the California Quality Instructional Commission and what they're proposing in the model curriculum, because I actually picked up this book, The Making of Asian America, over Christmas. And I didn't know a lot of the things that were said in there. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read a bit from this book, just a few passages, and see if it resonates with you. Okay, so from there, they boarded crowded sailing ships that carried as many as 510 people. The trips to the Caribbean lasted anywhere from 3 to 4 months and were plagued by the killing diseases of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, as well as severe sickness. Some of the first workers to arrive in British Guiana were treated with severe brutality, just like the African slaves they had recently replaced. Like Black slaves, South Asian indentured workers were severely punished and convicted under the law for neglect or refusal to work, absenteeism, desertion, vagrancy, and insufficient or incomplete work. Indentured laborers were, in the eyes of the planters who brought them, more akin to the monkey than the man. Indentured laborers inherited old slave quarters that were often sparse, lacked latrines, and suffered from leaky roofs, bad ventilation, or poor drainage. And the Viceroy, Charles Hardinge, came to this conclusion, describing the system as differing but little from a form of slavery. This is an Asian American history that has never been told, that doesn't get told in the US history. We learn about Black slavery. We learn about the African slave trade. We don't learn about the Asian slave trade. We don't learn about half of the things that we probably should have learned about because, again, we are erased. We are invisible. We just don't make it into the curriculum. And even, in prepping for some of my courses, I now have my students read the Mendes case. And the Mendes case, as you well know, preceded the Brown versus Board of Education case. But in reading that case, I couldn't help but see how, again, we are marginalized in the community. And this case was tried in California. And halfway through this, it was Mexican parents of Mexican descent, I think that's the language that they used, were fighting for equality in education, the desegregation of schools. And one of the arguments that was made in here says this: we perceive in the laws relating to the public educational system in the state of California a clear purpose to avoid and forbid distinctions among the pupils based on race or ancestry, except in specific situations. Note. So, in looking at the footnote, I went to see what exactly were those except in specific situations mean. And it says this: admission to children into other schools. This is section 8004. When separate schools are established for Indian children or children of Chinese, Japanese, or Mongolian parentage, the Indian children or children of Chinese, Japanese, or Mongolian parentage shall not be admitted into any other school. So, by California law, during this time, it was okay to segregate children of Indian heritage, Chinese, Japanese, Mongolian, but not Mexican. That is in the California state law. Again, why do we not know this? I don't know why we don't know this. Well, actually, I do know why we don't know this, because we're not important enough. We're not important enough to be put into the history books, and that has to change. So what do I want teachers to know? Know our history. Know that there's a huge group of students whose stories are not being told. Listen to their stories, make them visible. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Well, you're all important enough to me and to our School of Ed. And that's why we invited you, because you have a story to tell and it needs to be told. And, while you guys are talking, I'm thinking of, we lost Larry King, unfortunately. But a famous quote that's going around that he said was, I never learn a thing when I'm talking. And so it's like, sometimes we need to listen to you, because if I don't listen to you and I'm constantly talking, like, I'm not validating your experiences and your histories and your stories. And so, that's why we listened, because we're learning when we're not talking, and we're learning from you. And so I appreciate all of you coming here and giving up your time. And it's a Friday evening. We're gonna need a part 2 because there's so much more to say. but we value you. If no one else, like UC Irvine, the School of Ed, you know, our faculty, our staff, our students, we appreciate you. And so thank you. I don't know if Virginia, you want to say something else?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you too. Such a generous gesture for you to spend your time to and to be vulnerable. And, you know, it's just so interesting to hear the personal interwoven with all the thought that you've put into what, you know, what your personal stories mean when you think of things globally, or when you think of things relationally, or you think of things through the lens of being a teacher or the lens of being a scholar. I mean, you are such really fascinating people, and it just was very generous of you to spend your time letting us listen to your stories. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So at this time, we are going to close out. And if you'd like to say any last words to our panelists, if our panelists, you know, have any last things to say, thank you, everyone. Enjoy your evening. We hope to continue. Well, we will continue the conversation, and we will continue this series because we need to, we have to, and we got to keep it going. So thank you for your bravery. Thank you for speaking up, and thank you for making yourselves visible. So we appreciate you. So
Thank you, Acacia, for the opportunity.